Hey everybody, and welcome to Round Glass Review for the Olympus Zuiko 24mm f2.8 wide-angle lens. Let's just jump right into this. This was an Olympus-made lens. The typical lens uses for a 24mm lens in general include architecture, landscapes, and cityscapes. 24mm is very good for dramatic close-ups of subjects as well as deep depths of field. It's not great for portraits or pet photography, though there are going to be some samples of both in this video. In general, the distortion, the wide-angle nature of this lens makes living creature photography a little bit unflattering to the subject, but this lens does deliver well with portraits and pets. This lens came in three major versions: the H Zuiko, the Zuiko MC, and the Zuiko. The H Zuiko came in two different cosmetic versions. There was a chrome nose at the very beginning and a black nose towards the end of that run. Well, my lens's serial number is smack in the middle of the serial number range for the H Zuikos, so the black nose ones came about sometime before the halfway mark of the H Zuikos. Between those three, the optical design of this lens changed zero. What did change was the H Zuiko was a single-coated lens where the elements had a single coating, and the Zuiko MC was multi-coated. That's what the MC stands for. The later Zuiko was exactly the same as the Zuiko MC in terms of coatings. They just dropped the MC from the name. So the H Zuiko, what H means is that early lenses, and this was something all of the lens makers did, was use some sort of indicator at the front of their lens name to indicate how many individual glass elements the lenses contained. H, being the 8th letter of the alphabet, indicates that this lens has 8 individual lens elements. I believe that's in 6 groups, but I didn't write that down. Shame on me. For this video, I used an H Zuiko single-coated lens. Performance on the lens I use will illustrate the sharpness that all of the lenses in this lineup had. However, my lens does have somewhat less contrast and significantly greater flaring and ghosting than the later multi-coated versions. So bear in mind as you see the sample photos that some of the flaws in terms of flaring and ghosting stem solely from the lens's coating technology. One last note: if you're new to this series, there will not be any test charts or situations that I use this lens to intentionally set it up to succeed or fail. The reviews in this series are based on real-world use, and they aim to provide images and, where applicable, video that mimics how you are likely to actually use this lens. Alright, let's add nothing that you can't find on Wikipedia right now. The focal length and AOV, which is angle of view for this lens, are 24mm and 84 degrees respectively. The aperture range is 2.8 through 16 in full stop detents. Filter size is 49mm. Closest focus is 1/4 meter, which is about 10 inches. This lens was available in manual focus only. The systems that this lens was available in are Olympus OM only. It weighs 180 grams. And if there are any smaller 24mm lenses in the world, I certainly don't know about them. So, while this lens was available only in Olympus OM originally, this video is going to feature shots and videos taken on the OM1, OM4T, well, stills for those, obviously. Stills and video from the Sony a7S II. There's going to be some full-frame stills from the Canon EOS 5D and some 1.3x crop factor stills from the EOS 1DS Mark II. So looking at this lens's diagram, it looks like a pretty standard retrofocus wide-angle lens with an additional element. That said, retrofocus lenses are usually larger, much larger than this little Zuiko. Olympus lens technical details like this, like the design type and things like that, they're not widely available online, at least not any website I've found. And I don't have any of Olympus's old Zuiko lens technical references on my bookshelf. So calling this a retrofocus lens, I want to stress, is my own guesswork. Because this looks like a traditional retrofocus lens with an added element. And that added element being the large one in kind of the middle. So I think that what that large element does is allow the overall design to be smaller by changing the way that the light is focused through the lens. Whatever the design type of this lens, it worked well enough that the optical design remained the same across the lens's production lifespan, and that is testament to good upfront engineering. So, in general, some general statements about retrofocus lenses and why they're useful designs for photographers. They allow wide-angle lenses with SLR use. Without the retrofocus design, SLRs would be limited to a lens that has a focal length that is approximately equal to the flange focal distance, unless there was an invasive lens design like the old Nikon fisheyes. Also, retrofocus lenses provide better relative illumination across the image plane than do similar focal length non-retrofocus lenses. Also, retrofocus lenses give really deep depth of field at small apertures. We're talking about 8 through 16 in that range. And that allows for very dramatic landscapes and architecture shots with foreground and background objects in focus. The Olympus Zuiko 24mm f2.8 across all the design versions has superb sharpness that holds up on modern digital camera sensors. Sharpness is also excellent across the aperture range. The sharpness is also typical Olympus vintage lens sharpness, and this is something that not all sharp lenses can say, which is, this lens is sharp, but not to the point of being unflattering. Some sharp lenses, and this is something that Olympus did such a good job of engineering these, because they had these really sharp lenses that also flattered subjects. Some really sharp lenses can highlight every single flaw in a subject to the point that it makes your subjects look bad. So, like the majority, if not all, of the Zuiko prime lenses from the vintage heyday of Zuiko design, this really does a good job of being sharp without highlighting subject flaws. The lens also has excellent field illumination, which we touched on earlier, especially by wide-angle lens standards. There's very little light loss at the image edges. It's noticeable-ish at f2.8, but not unappealing. The aperture has 6 blades, and they provide a pleasing, if clinical and sterile, out-of-focus area. Compared to other wide-angle lenses, which wide-angle lenses can have very, very jittery and intrusive out-of-focus areas, this lens really doesn't. It does have a more jittery out-of-focus area than, say, a well-designed Fast 50, but compared to other lenses in its class, this lens imparts as close to no characteristics in the out-of-focus area as possible for a wide angle. And that leaves a pleasant and unobtrusive blurry field when the lens is open to larger apertures. Build quality and focus handling are also excellent, as is the case with high-end lenses of this lens's vintage. Lens damping too makes the focusing on this lens a delight, which again is the case for manual focus lenses, especially in the high-end range for this lens's vintage. And the size of this lens makes it a perfect pairing on any mirrorless camera system. This lens, especially in the H version, does flare and ghost, though it is something that all of the versions of this lens are prone to in different degrees. Now, I do not have any of the later MC lenses and never have, but sample online photos of this lens in the MC versions indicate that they flare less, though they do still flare. Of note, the H Zuiko appears to be, in terms of what I found of sample images online, the only one of these lenses that ghosts in myriad colors, especially the blues and the purples that this lens delivers in its ghosting and flaring. Sample online photos of the multi-coated versions do not show the rainbow effect that the H can deliver in some of its flares. The MC versions seem to flare exclusively in warm tones of reds and orange. For major lens design flaws, there is some axial chromatic aberrations that are basically nil, but lateral chromatic aberrations can be found at the corners in some shooting situations. And going back to the light loss, if you were to photograph a blank whiteboard, you will notice it, probably down to about f5.6, maybe f8, but especially at f2.8. However, in real-world use, the light loss in this lens is basically unnoticeable most of the time. If you have sky dominating your images, you will notice it at f2.8. This lens does exhibit minor distortion and field curvature at the edges of the frames, especially the corners. This will present a problem if you use this lens for video to make panning shots of brick walls, buildings, and graph paper. In practical application, the distortion and field curvature are functionally unnoticeable in still images. As a general rule, this lens has some limitations for video. That's almost always the case for lenses that were designed for still work and not video. For this lens, the aperture is stepped, and that will affect your ability to move through the aperture range smoothly during video recording. Also, it is stepped only at full stops, which means the aperture can slip out of partial stops very easily if you are trying to record a video with a partial stop aperture. The flare that the H version creates can be used for some flare effects, however, and probably quite pleasingly if you know what you're doing, unlike me. The front element is stationary as focus racks, meaning that when the focus racks, the front element will move in and out, but it will not rotate. And that provides benefits for gradient and CPL filter use. Focus throw is also very short, around 45 degrees. And that can make focus overshooting very easy during video capture. It can also lead to end of focus bumpiness in your video if you run up to the end of the focus faster than you're expecting to. So if you wanted to use this lens in a video with a focus motor, however, you could, because the focus ring is stationary, meaning it does not move in and out as the front element moves in and out. So that would simplify motor drive use. Focus breathing is also exceptional, especially considering that this is a vintage lens that was designed for still imagery and not video. Here is the best tip that I have for you. Buy a lens hood for this lens. I use this lens with the hood off of a 28mm f3.5 Zuiko, and that hood works just fine, and it does not get into the image, even at infinity focus. So what that means is that you don't have to spend the money to find a paired 24mm 2.8 Zuiko lens hood. Seriously, just go up online, get a 49mm wide-angle lens hood, and you're going to be just fine. There is no reason to think that it wouldn't work on this lens. Another tip for this lens is keep your light source out of the frame, but also keep it away from the edge of the frame. You can set this lens up to deliver high contrast images by not having flaring and ghosting, which do really sap a lot of the contrast out of your images. On a related note, this lens has really, really great contrast in even lighting and a little bit too much contrast in harsh lighting. So another way to use this lens well is to use it at sunset, under cloud cover, or in the shade of a forest or something like that, or if you're using it indoors to control your lighting to give you a nice even light. That can help this lens deliver better results for you. Olympus, back in the day, focused on making lenses that performed well and which were tiny. This lens checks both those boxes. If you want a compact lens that can focus, can take great stills, can take great video, and that fits in a back pocket, this is that lens. In addition to that, Olympus's old lens for the OM system always had that warmth built into their sharpness. They delivered the details, But whereas many lens makers' lenses provided sharpness that highlights the subject's flaws, Olympus somehow avoided that. The Zuiko 24mm 2.8, it's exactly that lens in that it delivers details and flatters your image's subjects. At home today on an OM film body or a mirrorless camera, this lens balances well with small camera bodies. It's exceptionally easy to use and hold with a small camera. It gives the user a compact carry-around with an amazing field of view. Something about the 24mm, it's just a fantastic wide-angle lens. The 24mm focal length doesn't feel like it's super wide, even though it is. It feels like it's wider than 28mm, of course, because it is wide enough to capture much more of the scene or to let you as a photographer get closer to your landscape foreground objects. 24mm to me is the most versatile wide-angle focal length because it's wide, and it does let you know that, but it's not obnoxious about the wideness like an 18 or a 15mm lens. And while yes, your results with this lens will absolutely vary, because these are vintage lenses and their current condition will stem from their care, their storage, and their use before you bought it, a good copy, even of the oldest H Zuiko version like I have, will perform stunningly well when used within the limitations it presents. Like all camera lenses, even a modern camera lens that costs as much as your car, this lens has some limitations, but on balance, they're minor, and good and proper photography practices will lead you away from the situations in which those limitations will cause you problems anyway. So here's my best advice to you for this lens. Get to know it, use it within the bounds it has, and really truly enjoy the fact that you're lucky enough to be able to use one of these to deliver the images and video that you want. This lens will not disappoint your creative voice and vision.